In today's Farm Report, calculating the bushel volume for grain bins before and after drying can be important, especially for wanting to make sure that you don't have to weigh every load as you transfer it from one producer to the next. Dan Martins with the University of Minnesota Extension Service Office has some helpful advice and calculating tips to make the trips go easy.
Here's a question from last week. We're buying corn from a neighbor and we'll dry it in a bin. We'd like to avoid hauling every load to town to weigh it. Does it matter much whether we measure the bushel volume of the corn before or after drying? The question hits on several concepts related to grain handling, weights, and measures. There could be several ways to look at this, and what makes sense to the buyer and seller at the end of the day is what counts the most. First, a little arithmetic review. The formula for the cubic foot volume of grain in a round bin is pi r squared h, or 3.14 times the radius again, times the height or depth of the grain. This gives us cubic feet, and then cubic feet divided by 1.25 cubic feet per bushel gives us a bushel volume. Then let's talk about test weight and moisture. A Wisconsin Extension article tells how test weight and moisture interact. Generally, as kernel moisture decreases, test weight increases. First, with normal drying, as the grain dries, it also shrinks in most cases, allowing for more kernels to pack in a bushel volume. I have dried corn in a microwave with high heat that makes the corn puff up a bit instead of shrinking. Second, dry corn is naturally more slippery or slick and allows for better packing or setting. You can see that wet corn is not very slippery when it sets up in a gravity or truck box. The amount of test weight increase with drying can vary with the condition of the crop, variety, kernel size, shape, and structure. The Wisconsin article has a table that lists typical change in test weight that might be seen with drying. For example, in drying from 20 to 15% moisture, a test weight gain of 2 pounds. In drying from 24 to 15, a 3-pound gain, perhaps. I found a Missouri Extension article that lists the volume shrink you might expect in drying corn to 15% moisture. For example, in drying from 20 to 15%, you might have 90% of the volume you started with. In drying from 24 to 15, you might have 82% of the volume you started with. This can be affected by drying temperature used and other factors. So it would seem to me in this situation, in trying to estimate bushels by calculating bushel volume of grain in the bin, it would make sense to measure the volume of grain in the bin after the corn is dried and to take several grain probes to sample and test for moisture and test weight. I think this would give a closer estimate of what you might have for bushels if you dried the corn and hauled it to market. Remember, there is a margin of error with every estimating formula you use and with every measurement you take. You're working to get as close to reality as you can with the time and effort you're willing to put into it. Buyers and sellers would also consider who has the cost of harvesting, hauling, and drying to determine a net value or cost for the crop. There's also a difference between the selling price and buying price at the grain elevator. Generally, with neighbors buying and selling grain, each is aiming to come out better than they would through other options. I'm Dan Martins with U of M Extension, and I hope things are working out well for you during the fall harvest season.
Catch the latest in local farm news with me, Scott Colomb, at 6:35 a.m. and 4 p.m. here on AM 960 KLTF or online anytime at fallsradio.com. Some producers may try natural air drying if it helps reduce the cost, but as Dan Martins with the University of Minnesota Extension Service Office explains, there are some guidelines that you should be aware of for end of October and early November drying, as well as some information on how to layer dry.
I talked recently about how test weight and bushel volume might be affected by drying related to how we measure bushel volume in a grain bin. This has been a pretty nice fall for people who use natural air drying based on generally good drying conditions in the field along with suitable air temperature for natural air drying. Our general guidelines for natural air drying this time of the year is to turn fans off when moisture of the corn at the top of the bin is less than 15.5%. Then to start fans again when air temperature is such that we can cool the corn to 30 degrees. After November 1st, we suggest turning the fan off when corn moisture at the top of the bin is less than 17% and average daily temperature is less than 30 degrees. You should run the fans again if you get a few days of warmer air. The moisture and fan shutoff guidelines are partly based on the amount of drying you might expect to get with typical air temperatures following the calendar. It's also based on the amount of time you can hold grain safely based on grain moisture and temperature. For example, when corn is 50 degrees and 20% moisture, we might be able to hold corn as long as 63 days before a noticeable spoilage would occur if the grain is clean and in good physical condition. I don't think I'd try to do that because temperature is not likely to stay uniform around the bin, and there are other risk factors. This does mean when grain is dry enough and cool enough, we can turn fans off if we have a few days of misty, rainy weather. The U of M Extension Natural Air Drying publication has tables that list equilibrium grain moisture content that can be reached based on air temperature and humidity. It has tables that show how long clean, sound grain might be held at given moisture and temperature levels. This information can be helpful for some decisions we make with handling corn for heated air drying also. I also found a University of Missouri article with some information about filling and drying in layers with natural air or low temperature drying. For example, one table and chart shows that for corn at 20% moisture, if adding wet grain on top of 12 feet of dry grain, it suggests adding 8 feet of wet grain and it might take 11 days to dry. Adding 2 to 4 degrees doesn't seem like it would mean much, but for this example, adding 2 degrees cuts the drying time from 11 days to 7.5. Adding 4 degrees cuts it to 6 days. Thinner layers are added for wetter grain with the goal of drying the grain sooner to make sure it dries before the risk of spoilage starts to set in. You can use an internet search tool to find this pretty easily by searching for University of Missouri layer drying and add the publication number G1310 if you want to be a little more sure. And again, if you're not using websites or don't get along well with that process, I know in Benton, Morrison, and Stearns County, you're welcome to call for information or help in finding it. I'm Dan Martins with U of M Extension, and I hope you're enjoying the change of pace that comes with a couple of rainy days.
A new USDA report shows feedlots last month bringing in 1.9 million head, 4% less than September a year ago, the lowest September placement number since at least 1996.
And that largely reflects the very, very poor returns that feedlot operators have been experiencing.
That may be an understatement from USDA livestock analyst Shale Shagam. In fact,
their losses have been huge.
Shagam says that also explains why feedlots marketed only 1.64 million head last month, 2% below a year earlier. They had, of course, paid top dollar for cattle earlier in the year, but last month fed cattle prices started dropping sharply, and
they really did not want to let these animals go to the packing plants at the prices the beef packers were offering.
So they're keeping cattle longer, trying to force the price up.
And what we're seeing is a large number of very, very heavy cattle.
And a feedlot inventory 2% bigger than a year ago, with the smallest percentage of heifers on record
as producers begun to expand their herds.
In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.